What would you do if one snowy morning you found a wounded stranger and his little girl hiding in your barn, knowing nothing about who they were, but feeling in your bones that their lives had just been torn apart in the lonely reaches of a Wyoming winter? Abigail Turner had already lost too much to risk her heart again. Yet that day, fate placed in her hands an injured cowboy and a child with eyes too old for her years. Outside, a powerful man was tightening his grip on the town, burning barns and breaking spirits. Inside, Abigail faced a choice: turn them away and stay safe, or stand beside them and risk losing everything she had left. If it were you, would you take them in, knowing danger was only a breath away? Would you fight for strangers who could change the course of your life forever? Come with me to a place where the wind cuts sharp, where silence carries secrets, and where one choice could spark a fight for an entire town's soul. Before we begin this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you won't miss a single heartbeat of this story. The wind had a way of speaking in Wyoming. On winter nights, it didn't just whistle past the windows of Abigail Turner's small sheep ranch. It groaned. It pressed its cold hands against the walls. It whispered to the bones of the lonely. Abigail sat at her worn oak table, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in her hands. The pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated a steady, low heat, but the chill still lingered in the air. Outside, snow swirled in a dance of white and gray, carried by a wind that had been howling since sundown. She'd stacked extra logs by the door before dark, knowing the storm was only going to get worse. It was the kind of night when the world felt far away, and maybe for Abigail, that was safer. 10 years had passed since her husband's death. Folks still called it an accident, but she knew better, knew in the quiet places of her heart that there'd been more to it. Since that day, she'd kept mostly to herself. Sheep didn't demand conversation, and the hills didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. But that night, just as she lifted her cup to her lips, a sound broke through the steady roar of the wind. It wasn't the creak of the barn doors or the rattle of loose tin on the roof. This was different. A muffled thump, then a low, almost human groan. Abigail froze. The sound came again, carried faintly on the wind from the direction of the barn. She set her cup down slowly, the ceramic making the faintest click against the table. Reaching for the lantern hanging by the door, she lit it with practiced hands. The warm glow pushed back the shadows in the room. But outside, the night was still a churning, icy black, pulling her heavy wool coat from its peg. She stepped into her boots. The leather was cracked from years of Wyoming winters, but they held. She grabbed her shotgun from its stand, not because she expected trouble, but because out here, you never took chances. The snow bit at her cheeks the moment she opened the door. She kept her head down against the wind and trudged toward the barn, the lantern swinging in her hand. As she neared, she saw the big doors were pulled almost shut, but not quite. Snow had drifted against the bottom, holding them partly open. She pushed one side wider, and the light spilled inside. At first, she thought the shadows were playing tricks on her. Then she saw him, a man, slumped against a stack of hay bales, his left arm clutched tight to his side. His coat was dusted with snow, his hat tipped low over his face. The dim light caught the sheen of sweat along his brow despite the cold. Next to him, curled up on an old horse blanket, was a little girl no more than 8 or 9, with tangled hair and wide, watchful eyes. She held a small, shivering dog against her chest. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the storm's muffled howl outside. Abigail's grip on the lantern tightened, "What in God's name?" she began, her voice carrying more steadiness than she felt. The man's head lifted just slightly. His eyes, pale and sharp even in the low light, met hers. There was a wariness there, the look of someone who'd been running a long time. "We'll be gone by morning," he said, his voice low and rough. "Just needed a place out of the wind." Abigail glanced at the child. The girl's cheeks were red from the cold, her little hands clutching the dog as if it were the only warm thing she had. "You're bleeding," Abigail said, her eyes dropping to the man's arm. She could see the dark stains spreading through the sleeve. "It's nothing that'll last," he answered, though the tightness in his jaw told her otherwise. The sensible thing, the safe thing would have been to tell them to move on. The world out here could be unkind to strangers, and unkind to those who sheltered them. She knew the risks. She'd learned them the hard way. But there was something in the way the girl looked at her, not pleading exactly, just waiting, like she'd already learned not to ask for more than people were willing to give. Abigail exhaled, the breath hanging in the cold air. "Stay put," she said finally. "I'll bring something hot." She turned, the snow crunching beneath her boots, and made her way back to the house. In the kitchen, she ladled out stew from the pot on the stove, added thick slices of bread to a tin plate, and poured hot water into an old enamel mug. When she returned, the man hadn't moved much, but the girl's eyes lit at the sight of the food. Abigail set the tray down on a bale, her lantern casting long shadows across the barn's wooden beams. The man hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. "Thank you, ma'am. Eat," Abigail said simply, and turned to leave. That night, long after she'd settled back into her own bed, Abigail lay awake listening to the wind. She told herself it was the storm keeping her up, but deep down, she knew it was the thought of two strangers in her barn and the quiet, unspoken question of why they'd come so far just to end up here, and whether the storm outside was the only one she should be worried about. Dawn came slow to the high country. The storm had blown itself thin by first light, leaving a pale sky and drifts stacked like white fences across the yard. Abigail Turner tied her scarf, struck a match, and set the coffee pot on the stove. The kitchen filled with the simple comfort of steam and the faint hiss of boiling water. She measured oatmeal by the cup, added a pinch of salt, and sliced 2 pats of butter. Old habits had a way of keeping a person steady. Stir clockwise. Keep the flame low. Listen to the room breathe. She carried the breakfast on a wooden tray, a mug of hot coffee, a bowl heaped high, 2 thick slices of bread warmed on the stovetop, edges crisp. When she opened the back door, a sharp January bite touched her cheeks. The yard was clean as a new page, her boot prints from last night already softened by wind. She crossed the 20 or so feet to the barn, the lantern from the porch swinging light over the snow. Inside, the air held the mixed scents of hay, leather, and animals. Her ewes shifted in their pen, hooves tapping, heads lifting to watch. The little dog gave a small warning bark, then tucked its nose back into its tail as if ashamed of the noise. Abigail set the tray on an upturned crate near the hay bales where the man and the girl had settled. She found them awake. The man Daniel Ross. He had said leaned against the stack with care, his left sleeve dark near the elbow. The girl, Ellie, had her hands wrapped around a tin cup she must have filled from the pump bucket in the corner. "Morning," Abigail said, voice even. "Food's hot. Coffee strong." Ellie's eyes were bright, though her hair had worked itself into knots in the night. "Thank you. Ma'am." Daniel tipped his hat an inch. More a habit than a need. We appreciate it. Eat, Abigail answered. Then we'll see what the day has in mind. She checked the sheep, broke the thin sheet of ice on the water trough with the back of her glove, ran a palm along a heavy ewe's flank, and felt the lively press of a lamb inside, life still choosing to go on. That fact, more than any speech, steadied her. When she turned back, Ellie had torn her bread in half and put a piece near the dog's nose. The pup sneezed and ate with quick, polite bites. Daniel didn't rush. He ate as if he'd learned that fast food sometimes costs more than slow hunger. A careful man, she thought, or a man who'd had to be careful for a long time. You'll need to clean that arm, Abigail said, nodding at the sleeve. I've got warm water and iodine. We can do it in the tack room. Light's better there. He hesitated. Pride is a stubborn thing. Then he nodded once. Yes, ma'am. After you finish, she added. No sense treating a man on an empty stomach. Ellie wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Can I help the sheep, miss? Abigail felt the smallest hitch in her chest at the question. It had been years since anyone small had asked permission in her kitchen or her yard. You can call me Miss Abby, she said. And yes, we'll pour grain in a minute. You can carry the small scoop. It's not heavy. The girl smiled, quick and grateful, as if permission were its own warm blanket. Outside, the sun lifted a little, turning the top of each drift to a narrow band of gold. The wind had calmed to a persistent breath. Abigail saw, for the first time that morning, a set of narrow tracks along the county road wagon wheels, maybe, or a sled. They angled east, half filled by new snow. She stood still, looking longer than the tracks earned. Out here, every mark meant something to somebody. She didn't like not knowing to whom. Back in the barn, Ellie slipped her arms into a small coat Daniel had laid over the blanket. The sleeves were too long, so she folded them twice. The dog trailed after her, paws making soft prints in the sawdust. When Ellie reached for the grain sack, Abigail showed her the right way to hold the scoop one-handed and balance the weight with her hip. See, she said, as they walked the length of the pen. You don't fight the load. You let it ride with you. Yes, ma'am, Ellie said, solemn as a pledge, like dancing with a bucket. Abigail surprised herself with a laugh. Something like that. The ewes pressed forward, crowding the rail, breath steamy. Ellie kept her feet, a little wobbly, but determined. They're soft, she said, touching a nose with one finger. They make a sound like a creaky door that's happy. That's one way to put it, Abigail said. Careful with that one. She nips when she's close to lambing. While they worked, Daniel set the empty tray aside and rose. He hid the effort as best he could, but there was no disguising pain. He kept the left arm tight and close. At the stall door, he paused and looked up at the hinge. Abigail saw the calculation pass over his face the way a shadow slides across a field. Without asking, he fetched a small hammer from the pegboard and tapped the loose pin home. The stall door settled into place with a quiet, grateful click. You didn't have to, Abigail said. Couldn't watch it fight itself all day. He answered, Things get tired if you leave them out of true cost time, she said. Cheaper than replacing a door, he said, and almost smiled. When the chores inside were done, Abigail took Daniel to the tack room. She set a basin on the workbench and poured hot water from a kettle she'd brought in under her coat. The room was narrow, a space that held the memory of horses, even though she hadn't kept a saddle animal in 5 years. She pulled a stool close. Sit, He obeyed, jaw tight. She slit his sleeve from cuff to elbow with a blade she kept sharp for twine. The wound wasn't clean. A crease along the triceps, jagged, angry. Not a deep bullet hole, but the sort that could sour and take a man slow if it wasn't minded. "This will sting," she warned. "Been through worse," he said. But when the iodine touched, the breath left him in a hiss between his teeth. He didn't pull away. He watched her hands the way a man watches a river ford, noting each stone. "How far did you come in that storm?" she asked. "About 6 miles," he said after a beat. "Maybe 7. We left the main road when the wind turned." "With a child," she said. Not quite a question. "With my child," he answered. His tone was steady, not defensive, protective. Abigail wound a clean bandage around his arm. Snug, not mean. "There's a cot in the tack room," she said. "If you sleep in here today, the air's warmer, less draft." "Miss Abby," he said. Quiet. "You don't owe us this." She tied off the bandage and cut the cloth. "That true thing you said about doors?" She answered. "People get tired when they're left out of true, too." He looked at her then. Not a long look. "Long enough." "Thank you." "In the yard." Ellie toted a small pail with both hands, bringing in chips of wood and pieces of kindling she'd gathered from the leeward side of the shed. She stacked them by the back door in a neat row. Abigail noticed the care more than the work. The little girl hummed while she stacked, a tune with no words. The dog sat on the top step, supervising with the gravity of a judge. "You hungry again?" Abigail asked when Ellie came in to warm her fingers over the stove. "I could eat a little," Ellie admitted, glancing at the pan as if afraid wanting was rude. Abigail spread peanut butter on bread, then cut an apple into quarters. "There's no ration in this house other than common sense," she said. "Eat when you're hungry. Rest when you're tired. Help when you can." Ellie nodded as if receiving a rule of life. "Yes, ma'am." They ate at the table. Abigail noticed she'd set 3 forks without thinking. The sight of them, laid like a small family, tugged at a tender, hidden place. She sipped coffee and listened to the storm quiet itself, to the faint creak of the barnwood settling, to Ellie telling the dog not to beg, because gentlemen never beg at the table. "Ladies either," Abigail added, and Ellie grinned. By noon, the sky brightened to a thin blue. The yard glittered with sun on ice. Abigail stepped out to check the fence line nearest the road. The track she'd noticed at dawn cut across the ditch, then vanished in a drift where the wind had done its work. A magpie hopped along the fence post, head cocked, tail flashing. Something in the back of Abigail's neck prickled, the old warning that saved you trouble if you listened. She looked a long time up the road toward town, then a long time the other way toward the broken ridge. Nothing moved. Back at the barn, Daniel had found a length of baling twine and was teaching Ellie how to tie a square knot. He kept his voice patient, the way you speak when you want a lesson to be a gift, not a task. "Right over left," he said, guiding her fingers, then left over right. "See? It looks honest. That's how you know it's true." Ellie worked her tongue between her teeth in concentration. At last, she pulled the ends, and the knot took its shape. "I did it," she breathed. "You did," Daniel said. His eyes met Abigail's over the child's bent head. Gratitude again. Deeper this time. Trust makes its own sound, she thought. Soft. Recognizable if you've been starved for it. Before supper, Abigail went to the cellar for potatoes and a jar of green beans she had canned at the end of summer. When she came up, Ellie had swept the kitchen floor without being told. The dustpan sat tidy. The broom leaned straight. Beside the stove, on the bench, lay a small thing Ellie must have made, while they'd been in the yard 3 matchstick twigs braided with twine into the shape of a star. Not much, but careful. A thank you without a single word. She picked it up and felt something ease inside her ribs. There were many kinds of payment in this world. Money was only one. As dust pooled purple in the drawers, Abigail carried a wool blanket to the tack room, then stood a long moment in the doorway. Daniel slept on the cot, his bandaged arm resting on his chest. The set of his mouth had softened. Worry had walked a mile or 2 away. Ellie curled at his feet on the horse blanket, the little dog tucked in the hollow of her knees. Abigail set the wool over both and pulled it up snug beneath the child's chin. She lingered. There were things a person could say in a moment like this. She chose silence. It felt right. The room held a hush that wasn't empty, the kind of hush that says a house is remembering how to be a home. She stepped back and closed the door until it latched. In the kitchen, she turned the coffee back on low to keep it warm and set an extra cup next to the pot without looking at it too hard. The wind outside had lost its hard edge. From the front porch she could see stars blink on above the ridge, clear as nails hammered into a dark board. She thought of the tracks on the road, of the questions piling up like snow along a fence. She thought of the way Ellie had called her Miss Abby, simple and certain. She thought of the knot, right over left, left over right. Honest, true. When you have lived alone for a long time, you learn to be careful with hope. It can bruise easy. It can slip through your fingers if you hold it wrong. But that night, standing on her porch, with the air cold and clean in her lungs, Abigail let herself feel a small, bright thing in the middle of her chest. Not joy yet, not safety, something like a pilot light. She went inside and locked the door, not from fear, but from the comfort of routine. Tomorrow would bring its own weather. For now, there were 3 forks in the drawer, a pot ready on the stove, and a star made of twigs on the windowsill, catching the last light. By the 3rd morning, the snow had settled into a crust that cracked under a boot heel. Abigail Turner rose before the sun, as always, and moved about her kitchen without needing a lamp. The faint glow of dawn slipped in around the curtains, outlining the coffee pot, the stove, the table. She had already decided to make biscuits real ones, cut by hand, not the drop kind and fry bacon to go with them. It wasn't a morning for oatmeal. It was a morning for something that said you're meant to keep going. She mixed flour, baking powder, and salt in a large bowl, then cut in the butter until the dough felt right under her fingers. While the biscuits baked, she stepped out onto the porch. Her breath rose in small clouds. Out toward the county road, she saw fresh tracks wagon wheels again, but sharper, clearer than the faint set from 2 days ago. These tracks were closer to the house, closer than she liked. Her gaze followed them until they curved out of sight behind a line of bare cottonwoods. She stood there longer than the cold should have allowed, that old prickle working along her shoulders. Tracks meant visitors. Visitors could mean trouble, especially when you'd taken someone in without asking the town's permission. Inside, the smell of biscuits filled the kitchen. Abigail set them on a plate, slid bacon onto another, and added a jar of choke cherry jam from her pantry. She poured coffee into her enamel mug and let herself think about nothing but the heat in her hands. In the barn, Daniel Ross was awake, already coaxing the fire in the old stove to life. Ellie was still curled under the blanket with the dog at her feet, hair sticking out in every direction. Daniel nodded a good morning to Abigail, but didn't say more until Ellie stirred. "Smells like bacon," the girl mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "That's because there is bacon," Abigail said. "Come on, eat before it cools." At the table, Ellie ate with the unselfconscious appetite of a child who's been cold for too long. Daniel ate slower, but she noticed his shoulders weren't as tense. His injured arm rested on his knee. He flexed his fingers once in a while, testing the bandage's give. "You've got visitors on the road," Abigail said quietly, keeping her eyes on her plate. Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Coming here. They haven't yet, but they're circling close." His jaw worked as if weighing words before speaking. "We didn't mean to bring you trouble." "I know," she said simply, "but sometimes trouble doesn't care what you mean." He looked at her a long moment, then set his fork down. "If they come, I'll talk to them. You don't need to be in the middle. I'm already in the middle." Abigail replied, "This is my place." Ellie looked between them, her small brow furrowing. "Are they bad men?" Daniel's voice softened. "We don't know, Elle. That's why we'll be careful. After breakfast." Abigail led the way to the barn. The air was brittle, but the sky was wide and clear. She showed Ellie how to carry a pail of warm water for the sheep without spilling it, moving slow over the frozen ground. The girl listened, asked questions, and even managed to shoo one of the nosier ewes back without flinching. Daniel kept to the shadows inside, mending a halter strap with one good hand. She noticed he worked like a man used to fixing things under pressure fast. Neat, no wasted motion. When she passed by, he said, "You run this place alone." "Since my husband died," she said, not stopping. "It's quiet work. Honest. Quiet doesn't mean easy." She glanced over. "No, it doesn't." Later that morning, she went to check the fence near the ridge. From the crest, she could see the road stretching toward Red Valley. A figure on horseback rode slowly, stopping now and then as if scanning the snow for signs. Abigail couldn't make out the face, but the rider's coat flapped long, and the horse's breath steamed like smoke. She watched until they turned toward town. By the time she got back, Daniel was outside splitting a small stack of kindling. He worked steady, not straining his injured arm, but not letting himself be idle, either. Ellie sat on the porch steps with the dog, feeding it bits of biscuit from her pocket. "Rider on the ridge," Abigail said. Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly. "I saw. Could be nothing. Could be—" He set the hatchet down, brushed his hands on his jeans. "If it's someone from the council, I should be ready." "Council?" she asked. He hesitated. "Later." He said, "It's complicated." She didn't press. Everyone had a later. They weren't ready to open. By mid-afternoon, clouds gathered again, dimming the sun. Abigail brought everyone inside early, fed them stew thick with potatoes and carrots. The warmth of the stove, the steady rhythm of spoons on bowls, made the outside world feel far away. Almost. When supper was done, Daniel helped Ellie into her bedroll near the stove. He sat back in the chair, gaze fixed on the flames. "You've been kind," he said after a while. "More than most would." Abigail poured the last of the coffee. "Kindness is cheaper than suspicion. At least until it isn't." He gave a faint, rueful smile. "You speak plain. Only way I know." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows in their frames. Abigail thought of the rider, of the tracks, of the unspoken things hanging between them. She had lived through enough storms to know sometimes the worst ones start quietly. When she finally went to bed, she left the lamp in the front room turned low, just in case. The next day broke pale and brittle, the kind of morning where frost clung to every fence post like lace. Abigail Turner was up early, pouring coffee into her mug when she heard the crunch of tires on the frozen ground outside. She moved to the window, her breath fogging the glass. A dark green truck pulled up by the front gate. Behind the wheel was a man she recognized instantly, Sheriff Tom Harper. His wide shoulders filled the cab, and his hat sat low against the glare of the winter sun. Abigail set down her coffee, her mind already running through the possibilities. Tom wasn't the type to make social calls during a storm week. She stepped outside before he had both boots on the ground. "Mornin', Tom," she said, pulling her coat tight around her. "Mornin', Abby." His voice carried the same easy drawl it always had, but she caught the sharpness in his eyes. "Mind if I step in for a minute?" Abigail gave a small nod and let him inside. The kitchen was warm, smelling faintly of bread from the night before. Tom stood just inside the doorway, stamping the cold from his boots. "Got some questions about a man folks say was seen near the West Ridge." He began, tall, early 40s, traveling with a young girl. Abigail kept her face steady. "We get the odd traveler now and again. Roads get bad. People look for shelter." Tom studied her a moment, the way lawmen do when they're weighing truth against omission. This one's different. Word is, he's been keeping to the shadows. Some folks are uneasy. "I imagine winter makes folks uneasy about all sorts of things," Abigail replied, her tone even. Before Tom could answer, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Ellie Ross appeared, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, the dog padding behind her. She stopped short when she saw Tom, glancing toward Abigail as if for permission to breathe. Tom's gaze softened, just a touch. "Well now, who's this?" "This is Ellie," Abigail said, resting a hand on the girl's shoulder. "She's helping me with the morning chores." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Pleasure to meet you. Miss Ellie?" Ellie gave a polite nod but said nothing. She drifted toward the table, pouring herself a cup of milk as if she'd been living there all her life. "Where's your pa? Little one?" Tom asked gently. Before Ellie could speak, Daniel Ross stepped into the room. His posture was easy, but Abigail could see the tension in his jaw. His injured arm rested in a sling she'd stitched from an old feed sack. "Right here," he said, meeting the sheriff's gaze head-on. Tom took his measure. "Named Daniel Ross. Ross, don't recall hearing it before. New to these parts," Daniel said. "We got caught in the storm. Mrs. Turner was kind enough to let us dry out." Tom's eyes shifted between them, reading the undercurrents. "You planning to stay long, just until I can travel without slowing her down?" Daniel answered, nodding toward Ellie. Tom let the silence stretch, then tipped his hat again. "All right, just keep in mind, this is a small town. Folks notice things. Sometimes they notice too much." When he left, Abigail stood by the window until the truck disappeared down the road. Daniel was quiet, his gaze fixed on the frost pattern spreading across the glass. "He's not the worst of them," Abigail said finally, "but if the sheriff's sniffing around, others won't be far behind." Daniel nodded. "I'll make sure we're not your problem." "You already are," she said, "but without malice. Doesn't mean I'm sending you away." The day passed under a heavy sky. Abigail went about her chores, but her mind kept circling back to Tom's visit. She wasn't naive. She knew Daniel was carrying more than a wound in his arm. There was weight in his silences, and a guardedness that didn't come from the weather alone. That evening, as the light began to fade, Daniel stepped onto the porch where she was splitting kindling. "I owe you the truth," he said. She didn't look up right away, just kept working the hatchet into the wood. "Go on. I wasn't just passing through. I came to Red Valley because I was asked to. The council wanted a new mayor, someone who wasn't tangled up in the usual politics. I said yes, maybe I shouldn't have. Some folks weren't happy about it. One of them decided to make it personal." Abigail set the hatchet down. "And they're the reason you're bleeding in my barn, instead of standing in some council hall." He gave a humorless smile. "Something like that. The night before, I was supposed to be sworn in. Someone ran us off the road. Ellie and I walked 3 miles in the snow before we saw your lights." She exhaled slowly, "And the men leaving tracks near my place. They're Kane's men. Harold Kane. He runs the old freight company. He wanted the mayor's seat himself." Abigail felt the pieces clicking into place. Kane had been a shadow in Red Valley for years, a man whose influence reached into too many pockets. "You plan to fight him?" she asked. Daniel's gaze was steady. "I plan to finish what I started, but I won't drag you into it." She almost laughed. "You've been under my roof for 3 days. You think I'm not already in it?" Their eyes held for a long moment. Outside, the wind had died, leaving only the distant crack of ice shifting on the river. Abigail knew storms didn't always howl, they could also wait, silent and patient, for the right time to break. That night, she kept her rifle closer than usual. 2 days after the sheriff's visit, the sky turned the color of lead, and the air carried that stillness that always came before more snow. Abigail Turner drove her old Ford into Red Valley for supplies. She didn't like leaving Daniel and Ellie alone, but the pantry was running low on flour and coffee, and she knew the general store would be quieter in the morning. The town was small enough that you could walk from one end to the other in 15 minutes, but big enough that news traveled faster than a prairie fire. As soon as Abigail stepped into the store, she felt eyes on her. Old Mr. Callahan was by the potbelly stove, whittling. 2 women from the church leaned near the canned goods, their voices pitched low. "Morning." "Abby," said Earl, the store owner, as he weighed sugar behind the counter. "You keepin' warm out there?" "Doing my best," she replied, setting her list on the counter. Earl's eyes flicked toward the door. "Heard you had company." That true Abigail kept her tone even. "Had a couple travelers stop by when the storm hit? You know how it is, can't turn folks out in weather like that." Earl gave a slow nod, but the way his mouth pressed thin told her he'd already heard the rest of the rumors. She gathered her things quickly, not wanting to linger in the swirl of speculation. On the way back, she stopped at the post office for her mail. There was only one envelope, thick and sealed with red wax. No return address. She slid it into her coat pocket, deciding she'd read it later. When she reached the ranch, Daniel was splitting wood behind the barn, his breath clouding the air. Ellie was nearby, making snow forts with the dog bounding around her. Abigail walked past them into the house, her boots tracking slush across the floor. Inside, she peeled off her gloves and opened the envelope. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco. The message was short, scrawled in a hard, uneven hand. "Send him back to town, or trouble comes to you next." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. Harold Kane's threats didn't bother with politeness. Daniel came in a few minutes later, brushing snow from his hair. Abigail handed him the note without a word. His jaw tightened as he read. "Kane," he said flatly. "I figured." Daniel folded the note, sliding it into his pocket. "I can be gone by morning." "You think that'll stop him?" Abigail asked. "You walk out of here. You're walking right into his hands." His voice was quiet, but she could hear the iron in it. "I won't put you or Ellie at risk." "You already brought risk with you," she said, her eyes steady on his. "The question now is what we do with it." Daniel hesitated, and for the first time she saw something crack in his guarded expression, a mix of fatigue, pride, and a man who'd been running too long. That afternoon, a thin snow began to fall, dusting the porch in white. Abigail sat with Ellie by the stove, teaching her how to patch a tear in an old quilt. The girl was quick with her stitches, her small fingers working the needle through the worn fabric. "Miss Abby," Ellie said suddenly, "why don't the people in town like my Papa?" Abigail paused, her needle halfway through. "Sometimes folks don't trust what they don't know, and sometimes they think power belongs to whoever's had it the longest." Ellie frowned. "Papa says power is just a chance to help." Abigail smiled faintly. "He's right, but not everyone sees it that way." When night fell, Daniel joined them at the table. The lamplight cast long shadows on the walls. Abigail poured coffee while Daniel outlined his plan. "If I can get into town and speak to the rest of the council before Kane makes his move, I might hold my seat. But it means going in, knowing he's set men to watch the roads." "You can't ride into that alone," Abigail said. Daniel's gaze was firm. "I don't plan to." Abigail leaned back, studying him. "So you have allies. Not many. Sheriff Harper's one. I think maybe a couple others who haven't been bought." She thought about the letter in his pocket, the whispering in the store, and the way the town seemed to be holding its breath. "If you're going to do this, you'll need more than a badge and a handshake." Daniel nodded. "Then tell me what you know about Kane, that the rest of the town pretends not to." It was a long conversation. Abigail spoke of land deals that had vanished, of freight shipments that never reached their destinations, of men who'd lost jobs and stayed silent because Kane had a way of making life harder if you crossed him. Daniel listened without interrupting, his brow furrowed in thought. When the fire burned low, Abigail rose and laid another log on. "You should rest," she said. Daniel's voice stopped her. "Abby, if I make it through this, I'll owe you more than I can repay." She turned, her face lit by the fire's glow. "If you make it through this, you'll owe me one thing. Make it worth the trouble." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, erasing tracks, but never the memory of where they'd been. The storm had deepened overnight, muffling the world under a thick white quilt, the kind of snow that made every sound softer, yet made danger feel closer somehow. Abigail Turner stood on her porch just after dawn, a mug of steaming coffee warming her hands. The barn roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the fence rails were barely visible above the drifts. Behind her, Daniel Ross stepped out, bundled in his coat, scarf wound around his neck. His injured arm was still in the sling, but he was moving easier now, the stiffness in his steps less pronounced. He glanced toward the main road, where faint tracks cut across the otherwise untouched snow. "Those weren't there last night," he said quietly. Abigail followed his gaze. The tracks curved off toward the ridge, too wide for a deer, too steady for wind-blown drifts. "They're watching," she murmured. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Kane won't wait long. If he thinks I'm still out here, he'll push harder." Abigail took a slow sip from her mug. "Then maybe it's time we decide what we're willing to push back with." They went inside to warm up, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Ellie Ross was at the table, feeding crumbs to the dog, her cheeks pink from sleep. She looked up as they entered. "Papa, can we make a snowman today?" Daniel hesitated. "Maybe later. Pumpkin." His voice was softer than his eyes, which stayed troubled. By mid-morning, Abigail had made a plan. "If Kane's men are watching the road, we'll use the ridge trail instead. It's narrow, but it'll take you into town without passing the freight yard." Daniel shook his head. "Not with you and Ellie on that trail in this weather." "I wasn't asking for your blessing," she replied, her tone even. "If you're riding into town to face Kane, you're not doing it without someone who knows these hills." Ellie piped up from her corner. "I know the ridge trail, too. Grandpa took me once in summer." Both adults turned toward her, but Abigail's voice came first. "Not this time. Ellie, you stay here and mind the place. We'll be back before dark." The girl's lips pressed into a small line, but she didn't argue. She only pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders and watched as Abigail began gathering supplies. By noon, the snow had eased into a fine flurry. Daniel saddled Abigail's old bay mare, and she readied a sturdy roan for herself. The cold bit through their gloves, but neither complained. Before they set off, Abigail knelt in front of Ellie. "Keep the door locked, and if anyone comes by, don't open it. Not for anyone but us." Ellie nodded, her small hand gripping Abigail's tightly for a moment before letting go. They rode in silence for the first mile, the horses picking their way along the narrow trail that hugged the ridge. Below them, the frozen river wound through the valley like a ribbon of steel. The air was sharp, each breath frosting before it vanished. Daniel finally spoke. "You don't have to do this, Abby." She didn't take her eyes off the trail. "Yes, I do. Because Kane's not just your problem anymore. Once a man like him sets his sights on something, he doesn't stop until he's broken it or owns it." He glanced at her, hearing the weight in her voice. "You've dealt with his kind before." "Not his kind," she said, "but men who thought fear was as good as law. My husband stood up to one once. Cost him more than it should have." The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file. Abigail led, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement in the trees. She caught nothing but the slow drift of snow through the pines. Still, her instincts kept her tense. An hour from town, they reached a bend in the trail where the pines opened to a small clearing. That's where they saw him, Sheriff Tom Harper, mounted on his chestnut gelding, waiting. "Thought I might find you two out here," Tom called, reining closer. "Kane's stirring things up. Word is he's holding a meeting at the freight yard this afternoon. Not the kind you get invited to." Daniel's eyes narrowed. Planning his next move. "More like rallying the ones who'll do his dirty work," Tom said grimly. "If you want to face the council, you'll need to get there before he poisons the well." "Then we'd better ride," Abigail said. Tom fell in beside them, and the three pushed on. The closer they came to town, the heavier the tension seemed to grow, like the air before lightning. Daniel's shoulders were squared, but Abigail could see the small shifts in his expression, the calculation, the readiness for what was coming. When they reached the edge of Red Valley, Tom veered off toward the council hall to make sure the way was clear. Abigail and Daniel dismounted behind the livery, tying their horses in the shadow of the building. From there, Daniel took a deep breath and said, "Once I walk in, there's no going back." Abigail met his gaze. "Then walk in knowing you've already got more than a title. You've got someone in your corner." For a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Trust, maybe, or the first glimmer of something that could grow if they lived through this. Then Daniel squared his shoulders and stepped toward the door. The murmur of voices inside swelled as he entered, and Abigail stayed just outside the threshold, ready to follow if needed. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of damp wool. Kane stood near the front, a broad man with a face carved from stone, his voice carrying over the room. And that's why we need someone who knows this town, not some stranger who... He broke off as Daniel stepped into view. A ripple went through the room. Kane's eyes narrowed, and his lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well," Kane said slowly, "look who decided to crawl out of hiding." Daniel didn't flinch. "I didn't crawl anywhere. I walked in the front door, same as any man who belongs here." The room went still, the kind of stillness where even the ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed too loud. Abigail knew this was the first clash, but not the last. The council hall smelled of old pine and dust, the kind of place where decisions had been made for decades, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with fists on the table. The men inside turned their eyes toward Daniel Ross, measuring him in silence. Abigail Turner stood just inside the door, her gloved hands folded loosely, but her gaze sharp. She knew this was his fight, but she also knew Kane wouldn't play fair. Daniel took a few steps forward, boots thudding against the warped floorboards. "I hear you've been talking about me," he said, his voice steady. "Figured I'd give you the courtesy of saying it to my face." Kane leaned an elbow on the table, smiling like a man who thought he'd already won. "All I've been saying is what folks ought to know, that our mayor's too busy hiding in the hills to do his job." Daniel's eyes didn't leave him. "You know exactly why I left town. And you know it wasn't hiding." A murmur ran through the men around the table. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, waiting for the show. Abigail's eyes swept the room, catching the way two of Kane's men lingered near the back, arms folded. They weren't here for debate. They were here for intimidation. She took a quiet step closer to Daniel, close enough that he'd know she was there if things turned. Sheriff Tom Harper slipped in from the side door, his presence a silent anchor. He didn't speak, but his hand rested on the back of a chair, close to the badge pinned to his coat. Daniel spoke again, his tone low but carrying. "This town voted me in because they wanted change. They wanted someone who wouldn't sell them out for freight contracts and backroom deals." Kane's smile thinned. "Careful, Ross. You're throwing around accusations in front of witnesses. That's the idea," Daniel said, "because I'm done letting you use fear to run Red Valley." The tension snapped like a stretched rope. Kane pushed back from the table, rising to his full height. "You've got a lot of nerve walking in here, after the mess you made. Men lost work because of you." Daniel's voice sharpened. "Men lost work because you cut their hours and pocketed the difference. Don't put that on me." One of the men in the back shifted forward, but Harper's voice cut through. "Not in this room," the sheriff said, calm but firm. "You want a brawl? Take it outside. This is council business." For a moment, no one moved. Then Kane chuckled a low, unpleasant sound. "You think standing here changes anything? I've got the contracts. I've got the votes." "Maybe," Daniel said, "but you don't have the people. Not anymore." Abigail saw it then, the flicker of uncertainty in a few faces around the table. They weren't ready to cross Kane yet, but the seed was planted, and Daniel knew it too. Kane leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a growl meant for Daniel alone. "You've got a daughter, Ross. Nice little thing. Be a shame if she got caught in the wrong place one day." The room went dead silent. Harper straightened, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. Abigail's blood ran cold, but she stepped forward before she could think better of it. "You just made a mistake. Cain," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. "You don't threaten a child. Not in this town. Not while I'm breathing. For a heartbeat." Cain's eyes locked on hers. Then he stepped back, feigning nonchalance, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Daniel didn't look away from Cain. "We're done here. But I'll see you at the next meeting, and I'll bring the people you've been robbing blind." He turned on his heel, and Abigail followed, her pulse still pounding. Harper met them at the door, giving a slight nod. "You've stirred the pot. Ross, now you better be ready for the boil. Outside." The cold air hit them like a wall, sharp and clean after the staleness of the hall. Abigail pulled her coat tighter. "You know he won't stop now." Daniel glanced at her, a shadow of gratitude in his eyes. "I know, and I'm done running from it." They walked back toward the livery, boots crunching in the snow. Behind them, voices rose in the hall, some angry, some uncertain. Change had begun, but so had the danger. As they reached the horses, Abigail paused. "Daniel, what he said about Ellie." He cut her off gently. "I won't let him near her." "That's a promise." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good, because you're not the only one who'd fight to keep her safe." They rode back toward the ridge trail, the sky heavy with new snow. Neither spoke much, but the silence wasn't empty. It was the kind that comes when two people have seen the same storm coming and know they'll face it side by side. When they reached the ranch, Ellie came running out, quilt wrapped around her shoulders, the dog at her heels. "You're back," she cried, her smile bright despite the cold. Daniel swung down from his horse and swept her into his good arm, holding her close. Abigail watched them for a moment, feeling something stir deep inside something she hadn't let herself feel in years. But the image of Cain's smirk lingered at the edges of her thoughts, a reminder that this was only the first clash. The real fight was still ahead. That night, the wind rattled the windows of Abigail Turner's ranch house, the kind of winter wind that seemed to pry at every seam and whisper through the walls. The snow had stopped, but the cold that settled in its place was deeper, sharper, inside. The fire in the hearth threw shifting patterns across the wooden floor. Daniel Ross sat at the table with a map of Red Valley spread out before him, a lantern casting golden light over the paper. Abigail poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one beside him before taking a seat across from him. "You've got that look," she said softly. He glanced up. What look the one men get when they know trouble's coming, and they're trying to outthink it before it arrives. Daniel let out a slow breath, rubbing his good hand over his face. Cain won't let what happened today slide. He'll hit back, and he'll do it where it hurts most. Abigail's eyes flicked toward the closed door at the end of the hall, where Ellie Ross slept under the safety of thick quilts. "Then we make sure he can't get near her." Daniel hesitated, then pushed the map toward her. "I've marked every place he controls: the freight yard, the saloon, the warehouses near the river. If we cut off his supply lines, we cut his power." Abigail studied the map. "You've been thinking like a mayor." He shook his head. "No, I've been thinking like a father who's run out of room to run." The sound came then 3 sharp knocks at the door. Both froze. The knocks weren't frantic, but they weren't casual either. Abigail rose, moving to the door with a slow, deliberate step. She kept her hand near the rifle propped against the wall as she called, "Who's there?" "It's Harper," came the sheriff's voice, low but urgent. She opened the door to let him in. Snow dusted his coat and hat, and his eyes held the same urgency as his voice. "You've got trouble," Harper said without preamble. "Two of Kane's men were seen heading this way an hour ago. One's got a mean streak a mile wide. I figured you'd want to know before they got any closer." Daniel stood, his chair scraping back. "You think they'll come here tonight?" Harper nodded grimly. "If they're feeling bold enough, Kane likes to send a message quick." Abigail's jaw set. "Then we'll send one back." They doused the lamp in the front room, letting the shadows take over. The three of them moved quietly, Harper near the front door, Daniel by the back, Abigail at the window where she could see the road. Minutes stretched. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire and the occasional creak of the old wood settling in the cold. Then Abigail saw a shape moving against the pale snow, followed by another. "They're here," she whispered. Harper's hand went to the revolver at his side. Daniel tensed, shifting his weight as much as his injured arm allowed. The first man stepped onto the porch, boots heavy on the boards. A second later, a shadow moved near the barn. Abigail's pulse quickened. "Barn," she breathed. "They're going for the horses." Daniel moved without thinking, slipping out the back door and circling wide through the snow. His breath puffed in white clouds as he kept low, the cold biting at his face. The man in the barn was tall, with a scarf pulled high over his face. He was cutting the latch on the stall when Daniel stepped into the doorway, his voice like ice. "Put it down." The man turned, surprise flashing in his eyes before he smirked. "Mayor Ross, figured you'd be tucked in warm." Daniel took a step forward. "Last chance, walk away." The man chuckled. "Kane says you've been making waves. I'm here to smooth things out." Before Daniel could answer, the man lunged. The fight was quick, brutal, Daniel using his good arm to block and strike, the other man swinging with raw force. The scuffle sent a lantern clattering to the floor, spilling light across the hay. Back at the house, Abigail heard the commotion and sprinted through the snow. Harper, close behind. She reached the barn just as the tall man grabbed Daniel's coat, yanking him off balance. Abigail didn't hesitate. She swung the butt of her rifle into the man's ribs, the crack of impact sharp in the cold air. He stumbled back, wheezing, and Harper was there in an instant to pull him away. The second man, seeing the tide turn, bolted into the dark, his boots thudding against the frozen ground. Harper shoved the first toward the fence. "You tell Kane this is his only warning. Next time, it won't end with you walking away." The man cursed but staggered off into the snow, clutching his side, inside the barn. Daniel leaned against the stall, catching his breath. Abigail's eyes searched his face. "You all right?" He nodded, though his voice was rough. "I will be." Harper looked between them. That was just the start. Kane will take this as a challenge. Abigail met Daniel's eyes, then let him, because we're not afraid anymore. For the first time since this began, Daniel felt it a shift, subtle but real. The fear was still there, but it had weight now, shape, something they could stand against, and they would. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving only the quiet of snow under the moonlight. But Abigail knew the quiet wouldn't last. The next move was Kane's, and it would come soon. The morning after the attack was bitterly cold. The sun had barely crested the snow-covered hills, but the light did little to soften the hard edges of the world. Abigail Turner stood on her porch, mug of coffee in hand, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The night's events still rattled in her mind, each moment replaying with sharp clarity the knock, The barn fight. The look in Kane's man's eyes before he vanished into the dark. From inside came the sound of Ellie Ross's laughter, bright and warm, chasing away some of the frost in Abigail's chest. Daniel Ross was at the table with her, showing her how to whittle a small piece of pine into something that looked vaguely like a bird. Abigail lingered at the door, not wanting to break the moment. It was Harper who brought the mood down. He arrived just before noon, riding hard, snow spraying from his horse's hooves. The lines on his face were deeper than usual, his jaw tight. "We've got a problem," Harper said, swinging down from the saddle. "2 barns were burned on the edge of town last night. Both belong to men who've been speaking up against Kane." Daniel stepped out onto the porch. "Anyone hurt?" "Not yet," Harper said. "But that's not the point. Kane's showing folks what happens when you stand against him. He's sending a message before you can rally too much support." Abigail's grip on her mug tightened. "And you think he's coming here next?" Harper didn't answer directly, but the look in his eyes was enough. Daniel's expression hardened. "Then we stop waiting for him to make the next move." They gathered around Abigail's kitchen table, the same map of Red Valley spread between them. Harper pointed to the outskirts where the barns had burned. "He's testing the edges first, keeping it just far enough from town center that folks can pretend it's not their problem. By the time they realize it is, it'll be too late." Abigail tapped a spot near the river. "This is where his freight comes in, isn't it?" Daniel nodded. "Most of it. Supplies, goods, even mail. If we can disrupt that." Harper frowned. "That's a dangerous game. He controls the men who work there. They're not all bad, but they're loyal to the man who signs their pay. Then we give them a reason to think twice," Daniel said. That afternoon, Daniel and Abigail rode into town. Snow crunched under the horses' hooves, the air so still it carried every sound. People watched from behind frosted windows, some with wary eyes, others with the faintest nods of acknowledgment. Word had spread about the council meeting, and more than a few about the barn fight. They stopped at the general store, where George Harper, no relation to the sheriff, was unloading crates. The old storekeeper gave them a quick glance, then leaned close. "You've stirred 'em up, Ross. Folks are talking, but they're scared." "Fear only works if you let it," Daniel said. George's eyes slid toward Abigail. "Careful. Kane's been asking about the widow who keeps such interesting company." They left the store with supplies, but neither spoke much on the ride back. The weight of what was coming pressed down on both of them. That night, the warning came in a different form. Abigail was in the barn checking the sheep when she caught it. The acrid smell of smoke, faint but distinct. Her heart lurched. She followed the scent outside, scanning the dark horizon. To the south, beyond her property, an orange glow licked the sky. Another barn, maybe 2. The wind carried the distant shouts of men and the crackle of burning wood. Daniel was at her side in moments. "Not hours," he said, "but close." Abigail's eyes stayed on the glow. "He's closing in." Harper arrived not long after, breathless from the ride. "That was the Miller place," he said, and the fire spread to the Jennings shed. Kane's men didn't even hide it this time. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then tomorrow, we bring this to the people. No more whispers, no more backroom threats. We call a meeting in the square." Abigail looked between them. "And if they're too afraid to show, then we show them they're not alone," Daniel said. His voice carried a quiet resolve, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be heard. Later that night, when the fires had burned low and the glow was gone from the horizon, Abigail stood at her bedroom window. She thought of the Millers, the Jennings, and the way Cain's reach spread like frost across a field, killing whatever it touched. She thought of Daniel, of Ellie, of the line they'd all crossed together without quite realizing it. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the worry, a spark had caught. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was something stronger than despair, something that told her the fight was worth it. The wind rattled the window again, but she didn't flinch. Winter had its claws in Red Valley, but winter didn't last forever. The square in Red Valley had never been so quiet. Usually, even in the dead of winter, there would be the steady bustle of wagons rolling in, merchants calling out prices, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. But on this morning, a strange stillness hung in the air, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Daniel Ross stood on the wooden steps outside the old meeting hall, his arm still in a sling, the cold nipping at his face. Beside him, Sheriff Tom Harper kept a steady watch on the streets leading in from the south. Abigail Turner stood just behind Daniel, her wool shawl wrapped tight, her eyes scanning the crowd, or what there was of it. At first, only a handful of people came, farmers with weathered hands and shoulders bent from years of work, the storekeeper George Harper with his brow furrowed, and Mrs. Whitaker, the school teacher, clutching her scarf against the wind. They gathered in small, tight clusters, speaking in low voices, eyes darting toward the edges of the square. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice carrying farther than he expected in the cold air. We're here because Harold Cain thinks fear will keep us quiet. He's burned barns, sent his men to threaten our homes, and tried to turn neighbor against neighbor. But fear only works if we let it. A murmur ran through the crowd, but most kept their heads low. Abigail stepped forward, her voice firm but warm. Some of you know what it's like to lose a roof, or a crop, or a season's worth of work. Some of you know what it's like to lose more than that. I've lived alone for years, but I'm telling you alone is not the way to win this. From the edge of the square, a shout cut through the cold. And what happens when Cain comes for you next? Turner. You think the law will save you? The man speaking was one of Cain's regulars, his coat too fine for a man who claimed to be a farmer, his smirk sharp as a blade. Before Harper could step in, Daniel spoke again, his voice steady. If you're here to listen, you're welcome. If you're here to threaten, you'll find that harder than you think. The man's smirk faltered, but he didn't reply. More townsfolk trickled in as the minutes passed. Some came out of curiosity, others because they'd heard about the fires and wanted to see what would be said. Daniel told them about the freight routes Cain controlled, the council seats he'd bought, and the men he used to enforce his will. He didn't shout, didn't embellish. He spoke like a man telling the truth, plain and clear. Then Abigail told them about the night Cain's men came to her barn. She didn't describe herself as a victim, but she made them feel the cold of that night, the weight of every footstep in the snow, the sound of fists striking in the dark. It stops, she said, when enough of us decide we've had enough. A stillness settled over the square again, but it was different this time, less like fear, more like a gathering wind. Mrs. Whitaker was the first to speak. What do you want us to do? Daniel met her eyes. Start by standing together. If Cain sends his men to burn another barn, there will be 10 of us there before the flames spread. If he cuts off a man's freight, we'll haul it ourselves. He can't fight all of us at once. It wasn't a rousing cheer that followed, but nods. Quiet, deliberate nods. The kind that meant people were weighing the cost and finding it worth paying. When the meeting ended, Folks didn't leave right away. They spoke to one another, voices low but urgent, plans forming in the frost-laced air. Daniel felt something shift inside him, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they'd lit the first spark. But the day's calm didn't last. As the sun dipped low, Harper rode up hard from the southern road. His horse's breath came in steaming bursts, and his voice was tight. Kane's holding court at the saloon. He's telling folks you're planning to raise a mob. He's daring you to walk in and face him. Daniel's gaze went to Abigail. She didn't flinch. Then that's exactly what you'll do. The saloon was loud even before they reached it, the sound of laughter and boots on the floorboards spilling into the street. Inside, Kane sat at a table near the center, his coat draped over the back of his chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Around him sat half a dozen men, their eyes narrowing as Daniel and Abigail stepped through the door. "Well," Kane drawled, leaning back in his chair, "if it isn't the mayor who forgot to take his oath." Daniel didn't rise to the bait. "You've made your point. Kane, you can scare some folks. You can burn their barns. But you can't break everyone." Kane's smile was slow and cold. "I don't have to break everyone. Just enough to keep the rest in line." Abigail stepped forward, her voice cutting through the haze of smoke and noise. "Then you'll have to start with me." A hush fell over the room. Kane's men exchanged glances, but no one moved. Kane's eyes lingered on Abigail a moment longer, then flicked back to Daniel. "Careful, Mayor. You don't want to make this personal." Daniel's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "It already is." When they left the saloon, the street felt colder than before, but in that cold, there was a kind of clarity. The lines were drawn now, sharp and unmissable. Kane had shown his hand, and so had they. The fight wasn't over. It hadn't even truly begun. But the storm was coming, and this time, they'd be ready to meet it. In the quiet heart of Lonely Widow found an injured cowboy and his little girl in her barn, unaware he was Newtown mayor, lies a truth that speaks to anyone who has known loss, fear, or the weight of standing alone. Abigail's story reminds us that courage is rarely the absence of fear. It is choosing to act in spite of it. She could have shut her door and turned away, protecting herself from danger. Instead, she opened her barn, her home, and eventually her heart, discovering that standing together is the only way to face what threatens us. For those of us who have lived long enough to see life's trials come and go, this tale is a gentle but firm reminder, no matter our age. We are never too old to make a difference. Helping someone in need, even when it costs us comfort, can ignite change far beyond what we see. Trust, kindness, and quiet resilience are not small things. They are the roots that hold a community together. And sometimes, by protecting others, we find the healing we didn't know we needed ourselves. Thank you for spending your time with us and joining this journey through the windswept heart of the frontier. If this story touched you, warmed your heart, or brought back memories worth cherishing, we'd be grateful if you showed your support. Please like this video, share it with someone who would enjoy it, and subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss the next tale from the wild and beautiful West. Your support keeps these stories alive.